Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever in the world you happen to be. And a very special good evening to our viewers who may be tuning in from Taiwan. The subject of our discussion this morning, and also the subject of the new Carnegie paper that spurred us to organize this panel, a study of Taiwan's opportunities in emerging industry supply chains. And you can read or download our study from the Carnegie Endowment website, carnegieendowment.org. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at Carnegie. I'm also the co-author of this volume with my good colleague and friend, Mike Nelson, who is a senior fellow at Carnegie and who will moderate the discussion panel that follows. And that panel is going to dig into one of the two industries we explored, life sciences and safer software, with a deep dive into Taiwan's safer software opportunities amid a good deal of global dynamism, but also disruption. Now, just to give you some context, back in 2019, our Carnegie Asia program launched a collaboration with the Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research in Taipei that has involved convening a series of roundtables with US and Taiwan stakeholders. And this effort has had two major goals. First, to examine some of the challenges to Taiwan's future competitiveness and comparative advantage in, as I said, a world of technological change, global economic disruption, and rapidly evolving political risk. But then second, to explore where and how fresh partnerships, in particular between US and Taiwan players, can help to bolster Taiwan's economic future. And the rationale for this stems in part from a sense that economic security involves more than just having the right economy for right now. To an even greater degree than current economic performance and structure, it involves having the right economy for 10 to 20 years from now. And so our initiative has in the past taken deep dives into two other areas, Taiwan's innovation ecosystem and the energy market risks it faces and its energy technology opportunities too. And by the way, you can download and read those two prior studies also at carnegieendowment.org. Now, in this latest paper, we've turned our attention to supply chains, which have been very much in the headlines lately. And the fact is, from my vantage point at least, globalization bequeathed a system that seemed efficient until it was tested by the multidimensional crises of the last 2 years. And in industry after industry now, we see both C-suites and governments planning for a world of disruption. They're aiming to build resilience and at minimum greater redundancy into their supply chains. But there's another factor, and that's political risk, that is complicating all of this planning. And that's especially true in technology-intensive industries. The emergence in particular of multidimensional strategic competition between Beijing and Washington looks set, I think, to become a long-term structural trend that will be with us for a long time. And that's a sea change, and it's going to bleed into many industries, and it will rejigger supply chains. But amid the disruption, it's been our premise, Mike's and mine, that some economies will have fresh opportunities to attract investment, build out new industries, and diversify their growth drivers. So we launched into this project because we suspected that Taiwan was one such economy that could benefit from the supply chain rethink. And Mike and I had a very straightforward goal to help refine the competitive choices for Taiwan while highlighting some of the unique comparative advantages that might make Taiwan an attractive place for new global investments. Now, everyone who mentions Taiwan and supply chains turns immediately to semiconductors. But since we like being a little different, we picked two other industries to dig into. The first, as I said, is the life sciences, including biotechnology and precision medicine. And despite 20 years of concerted effort and some successes, especially with drug development and diagnostics, Taiwan has just not captured a role or a market share globally analogous to its multi-decade build-out in semiconductors. Now, as I said, the panel that follows is going to drill down into software. So let me just make a basic point about the life sciences piece that actually bleeds over into some of the software themes. Our core argument is that for Taiwan, trust will be the crucial variable and competitive advantage. Why? Because China, for example, is in the midst of an impressive and large-scale biotech build-out that leans hard on its advantages in scale, something that Taiwan, with only about 24 million people, couldn't possibly replicate. But trust is Taiwan's most valuable currency. By contrast, that includes Taiwan's good governance, trust in the transparency that comes from being a well-functioning democracy, trust in well-considered regulation and administrative procedures, and trust in Taiwan's transparent collection, use, and management of high-quality public sector data. So in the life sciences, Taiwan could, for example, leverage its advantages with high-quality medical data to become a locus for clinical trials. And it could leverage other advantages for global supply chains in the drug discovery, advanced diagnostics, and personalized medicine markets. But to do so, it's going to need policy and regulatory changes and some new strategic investments. And we have a whole bunch of recommendations in this paper, including around reimbursement policies, but also things like university partnerships. We talk about regulatory coordination, and we'd like to see a pharmaceutical and medical device agreement between, for example, Taiwan and the United States, drawn from the annexes of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. At base, the paper emphasizes international partnerships that could naturally complement a revitalized and broadened innovation strategy for Taiwan. Taiwan should aim, and I'll stop here, to be a trusted hub, a trusted vendor, a trusted tester, and a trusted conduit for technology-intensive R&D and production, 4 elements of trust. And that's the basis for the discussion that's going to follow on software, namely, whether Taiwan can be positioned as a leader in testing, validating, and deploying software so that the software and services produced by local companies and their international partners is more tested and more trusted than competing products on the market. And much of this, by the way, is of a piece with broader efforts that we're building here at Carnegie in our rapidly expanding suite of work on Asian technology futures, including for Taiwan, but also India, Korea, China, and Japan. So I thank you for tuning in. I hope you'll read and download our study at carnegieendowment.org. We're excited about the paper. And with that, let me hand it to my friend and colleague, Mike Nelson, to moderate the discussion. Mike, over to you and our all-star panel.
Thank you very much, Evan, and thanks for collaborating with us with the Technology and International Affairs program on this project. I think it turned out very well. It's got the regional knowledge combined with our technology expertise, and we were able to recruit great people from both the U.S. And Taiwan for a very lively and informative workshop that led to many of the recommendations in this report. And 2 of our 3 panelists were part of that discussion. Before we turn to them, let me very quickly highlight a few things that make this report different. And that is that, first of all, when we talk about cybersecurity, there's a tendency to focus on tracking down the bad guys and intercepting nation states that are trying to get inside of our information infrastructure. Second thing is the focus on the victim, trying to get companies to train their people not to open attachments, to practice better cyber hygiene. But I think we would argue that at least 70, maybe 80% of the problem could be solved if we just had less vulnerable software. And that's the focus of our report. It's not just about making sure that companies develop more secure, more reliable, more tested software. It's also about fixing the software supply chain, the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pieces of code that are available online for people to cobble together to create an information system. The other thing we focus on quite a bit is on getting better data, particularly for machine learning algorithms. Having good data is essential if you're going to have good results. So that's another place that Taiwan has an advantage, as Evan mentioned. The other thing that is important to look at in this arena of creating a more secure information sphere is to not just focus on technology tools. There are some very good ones, and our panelists will talk to that. But there is no perfect way to test a piece of software and to anticipate every way it could be compromised. So you also need corporate culture at tech companies and at the companies that buy technology so that they're careful enough to avoid the most obvious and well-known problems with software. We're going to focus on the third piece, and these are pieces that Paul Rosenzweig and Justin Sherman have identified and are looking at. This third piece is government policy. And this isn't just about tech policy. It's about education policy that can fund training for better software engineers, not just cybersecurity experts, but software developers who know about software security. It's also about procurement policy, making sure that when governments buy technology, they ask the hard questions. So that's the frame. And again, we're trying to do something new here and not just talk about the usual topics of user training and cybercrime investigations. So let me turn to our first speaker. Ari Schwartz is an old friend. We've known each other for at least 20 years. He's been at the White House. He's been at the Department of Commerce. And for several years, he's been at Venable, a law firm here in Washington, which has a thriving cybersecurity risk management practice. He bridges the two worlds of law and technology. And I turn it to you, Ari, to give us a sense of how we can tackle what is obviously a big, hairy problem that's getting worse every day.
Yeah, I'm going to focus a little bit on why this has become a bigger problem now and why it's just kind of a little bit of a high level view on it. And so, I mean, the obvious piece here is that all of our goods and all of our software that runs those goods is becoming smarter, more heavily on the telecom networks in order for those goods and products to communicate with each other. At the same time that those have become more complicated, we also have all these other stresses on the supply chain that we hear about in the news all the time, et cetera, that add some complexity to it. But also that these goods, because they're so complex, can update after the fact. So something could seem good on Monday, and then on Tuesday, something happens. Someone buys that company or et cetera. And then on Wednesday, the old product updates and becomes evil, right? That's the big national security concern here that we have. It's not necessarily, and on top of that, as you were saying, Mike, we have lots of instances where software is just not well coded in the first place. So already, so that becomes a very kind of difficult problem to worry about all of that stuff at the same time in the software supply chain. Some countries, including many, and some pundits, including many in the U.S., have taken the position that the safest goods and software are really created in their home country by locals. But obviously this comes with its own set of problems too. It's difficult to track who created the software. And software is not in that way, it's not a single entity, one person creating all the software, right? You're taking different pieces from different libraries. You're having a lot of people integrate stuff together. You have old stuff and new stuff together. Very difficult to track. Second of all, it doesn't ensure security, as we were saying. Security has lots of different phases to it. It could be that it updates badly, but it also could be that it's poorly coded or that it has vulnerabilities that have been around for a long time and people just don't know that they're there, et cetera. And then third, this plays in the hands both domestically and internationally of protectionists that aren't really interested in security, right? And it harms countries like the U.S. and Taiwan and many of our mutual allies that seek to support the idea of exporting high-tech goods and services to the rest of the world. So I think that it becomes problematic as well if we just look at this from a position of, we have to create everything locally and only things created in the country and used in the country are the way to go. A better approach, right, which is consistent with the ideas from this paper, is that we partner with allies, right? That we build mutual trust with allies based on standards and develop better and better standards, develop better and better software processes in place that build trust. And I think that that's really the focus that you have with this paper. And I think that a lot of the countries out there are looking for how to go about doing. Also very complicated, but it puts us on the right path rather than the idea of focusing so much on only how do we create everything locally in a global economy like this.
Thank you very much, Ari, and thanks for setting this up so well. Just to reiterate your point about trust, that issue applies to both sections of our report, both pharmaceuticals and cybersecurity. I like to say that software is a bit like antibiotics. If you get a bad batch, it could kill you. But it's hard to know if it's good or bad. There's a lot of things that have to go into making sure that both drugs and software are safe for you to use. Let me now turn to Joy Chan, who was part of our workshop. She's worn several hats that are directly relevant. Currently, she's the Deputy CEO at the Taiwan Network and Information Center, or the TWNIC. She's the head of the Taiwan Computer Emergency Response Team Coordination Center, so she gets to see what happens when networks and systems are not well protected and are compromised or brought down. She also, prior to her current job, worked at the Institute for Information Industry, where she led efforts to spur development of safer software. So Joy, give us a view from Taiwan, and thank you very much for staying up late and joining this discussion.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Ari, for framing the question. I think that the trust is really the key word for a lot of things that we are talking about today. And where I'm sitting here in Taiwan versus many of you may be sitting in the bigger places and looking at the software, I think that the safe software doesn't come easy, and they don't come cheap either. When I look at the software, and when I look at many of the startup and many software companies who are developing software here in Taiwan, what we are looking for is something that's quickly to be launched, providing the function and feature that they want to be doing, and with, of course, less cost. But then at the end of the day, the software isn't like something that's disposable. We build things on top of the software that we've been building. We put patches on, we'll put additional feature on that. And having that the safe software that requires a lot of the proper security review, the software testing. But many people says that, okay, well, I want to launch the product as soon as possible because I want to start making revenues. I want to launch the product so that the users can be used as soon as possible. But then at the end of the day, that we realize without the proper testing, without the proper safeguard, that takes a lot of the time, takes a lot of the money, then the system is going to be something that people are not able to use it because due to the vulnerability, due to the hacking or malicious virus there. So we understand that the proper the security checking, the proper safe validation is a must. So when people are developing product, I think that sometimes if you look at that, if we are thinking the product is going to be going global, then the thinking mentality is going to be different because you're looking at something that's going to launch globally versus something that I can just launch for the community, for domestic, because that's something that you can sacrifice a lot and you can compromise a lot. But then when we are saying that, okay, launching some product here in Taiwan, make sure it's quick, make sure that it can launch on time so we can distribute to the world. Then we realize when you want to go across the border, you want to maybe go to, say, Southeast Asia or other countries, then we realize that without the proper caring of the safe software, then there's many problems going to be happening. And then this is why many of the local companies can only stay local and never really go abroad. So I think the safe software requires many of the things. But if you develop the product without thinking globally, many of the the safeguard, it's going to be easily forget. So the trust thing is something that the developer, the product developer, and the software coder needs to be done all together, because only when you follow the standards or follow some best practice, all this is not going to be forget. Otherwise, when the end of the day, that the tech debt's still going to come back to the company or to the developers. So software to be safe, to be secure, that's like a must. That's how I see it from Taiwan. And that's, I think, it's pretty much true globally.
Thank you very much, Joy, and thanks to you and to Ari for keeping it short and yet packing in a lot of insights. Our last panelist is Megan Stifel. We know Megan very well at the Carnegie Cyber Policy Initiative. She's worked with us on a number of projects. She's recently become the Chief Strategy Officer for the Institute for Security and Technology, and she is also the founder of Silicon Harbor Consultants, which provides strategic consulting about cybersecurity operations. And she's the only lawyer on the panel, which also makes this an unusual panel. So give us a perspective, Megan, from based on your experience, and then we'll get to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Mike, and good morning or good evening, or good afternoon, as you said. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and to have participated in the conversation that I think helped to inform your paper. Congratulations on it. So I think about this really kind of with three elements in mind, and those would be thinking about the power of the government, whether it's the government of Taiwan or ours or others, thinking about then the role of the private sector, and finally, what are the international aspects of this? And I think, so just to briefly kind of touch on thinking about the role of the government in this space, there are a number of levers that can be pulled. And what we're thinking about here is probably, I would say, a failure of proper incentives in the global marketplace. So what levers can the government pull to try to address that? And some are more favored by different approaches to the role of government in the economy, and some are less favored. But certainly you can take as an example the trend that's happening in the United States, where the government is using its procurement power to enhance the security of software and hardware components. And one of the ways that it's thinking about doing that is something that you touched on in your paper, is this idea of piloting trust marks. And obviously trust marks can do a number of things, but among other things, they can help build trust, but also communicate. There's also the ability for the government through its procurement power to facilitate the evolution in standards bodies. And certainly having governments encourage or otherwise require their agencies to participate in these global standards bodies that have been touched on by a few others, I think is also an important tool in the government's power to try to advance the objectives here. We can also think about the role of government, and I think part of this issue is really not only addressing the market incentives, but also thinking about the multifaceted issues that have brought us to this place. And part of that is something we've touched on, I think, a little bit in our conversations before, is this idea that the education system has not evolved, and we've not generated computer scientists who graduate from studies and are also security experts. In some cases, particularly in the United States, it's a case that they actually can graduate up until I think most recently with very little understanding of security. So thinking about the role of government in evolving the education requirements for computer science degrees, requiring certain capabilities of graduates to participate in government programs, and then thinking about how those education requirements can be used in another tool of the government, which is to think about subsidies. And I think your paper takes to my earlier point about what's the role of government. Is it the devil or is it the angel? We're not talking about subsidizing per se the developers in sort of the traditionally negative sense, but more in the sense of giving them subsidizing access to expertise. And so if we think about education building better experts in securing code and elsewhere, that's the education system and subsidies are other levers of the government. I think the other kind of third and fourth things, or fourth and fifth things, would be thinking about how the government can use its trade relationships. And you touch on this in the paper as well, and thinking about bilateral trade conversations and the conversations that the U.S. government is having with Taiwan, and bringing secure coding into that conversation and secure supply chains. And the fourth is to think about, or fifth, I've lost track now, is this idea of transparency. So we've talked about, among other things, if at least in the United States and elsewhere, I think the ability for the government to set standards and have or requirements through regulation is actually an element of transparency. But also there are other tools that require transparency, and we're talking about some of these here, and they can be the case elsewhere, about how public is information about data breaches and the like, and how much information is disclosed. You touched in your paper about whether vulnerabilities that were leveraged to gain access would then be more widely known, such that the software that was probably the weak point is able to be, a patch is able to be developed. It can be pushed out within the marketplace. So the trade relationships, education, transparency, subsidies, and procurement I think are levers of the government. I think you also, the second piece I mentioned is thinking about cooperation with the private sector. And that can take two forms. The one I think most favored is a voluntary one. And so you talk about a combination of not only particularly thinking about trust marks, that could be a procurement requirement, but it could also be something that industry could voluntarily decide to begin itself. But then there are certainly other elements and aspects of the public-private partnership piece that is often discussed around cybersecurity that are also, I think, key to evolving this and promoting a more secure software supply chain. The third piece I would quickly mention is kind of what are the international dynamics and what are the international opportunities here? And I think first on the first piece of your paper is to say that this is not only limited to Taiwan. Taiwan is the subject of your paper, but there are it's not only applicable to Taiwan and the recommendations that you make. Many of them may be more applicable to the U.S.-Taiwan relationship or Taiwan's role in the economy, but other governments and industry can certainly learn from the recommendations of your paper. But taking a more granular thought about this is to think about the role of opportunities such as APAC and Taiwan, as you mentioned in your paper, looking at working to develop a framework to think about secure software supply chain in the APAC space. And again, to think about this opportunity within international standards bodies to move toward a more secure software supply chain set of standards, and taking a leading role in those standards bodies, hopefully in partnership with US and like-minded countries. So those would be my quick wave tops.
So Megan, thank you very much. And thank you in particular for mentioning three of my favorite words. First one is international, which is in the name of the Carnegie Endowment and is critical to addressing this problem. The second is standards, which I've spent a lot of time on. But the one that really got me excited was transparency, because I always argue that the answer to any innovation policy problem, doesn't matter what the problem is CITE, competition, innovation, transparency, and empathy for the user. So put yourself in the user's shoes. But transparency will get you a lot more competition. It'll often get you a lot more innovation, and standards helps as well. So thank you very much for bringing up those three different aspects of this very hard problem. I'm going to start with the hardest question. And that is, how do you communicate this issue to the political leadership of Taiwan or any other country? They tend to want to have one or two answers, and they want to be able to tweet the answer because that's what fits in a headline. So my challenge to you is let's look at the world. Let's look at what other governments are doing to promote safer software development and more secure supply chains, and give me the one thing that you think really seems to be working. We have Israel, which is a superpower in developing cybersecurity tools. Estonia has been very good about developing secure e-government. But is there something that you would point to and say that policy really made a difference, both in that country and perhaps even globally? So, Megan, do you want to start with that, since you mentioned international more than anybody else?
I saw Ari come off mute first. So, my experience is primarily been from within the U.S. government and kind of watching the great work that Ari and together with folks like you and others at Carnegie have worked on over the past several years. But I think, I would say that sort of return to what I had mentioned before and thinking about this idea of transparency, because there are several who share that view that sunshine can solve a lot of problems, and so I think, frankly, the United States has been slow to recognize that in this space, and so we're now, I think, in a phase where we're talking about transparency around data breaches and ransomware payments and the like,
but there are barriers to that. I mean, if there's a breach at my company, sometimes I can't really reveal whose software was responsible. I might have a contract that says, I can't reveal problems that I might have. I mean, there's cultural differences, cultural barriers as well. You don't want to tick off your supplier of a critical piece of software. I mean, what kind of transparency specifically? I mean, there's lots of different types here.
Well, I think they're agreed. In the paper you touch on, and this is slightly different from what I was mentioning a moment ago, is around this idea of transparency in the role of breaches to companies and what those breaches can lead to, but also thinking about how might we prevent some of that. And how we might prevent some of that is an effort that you also touch on in the paper, and that a mutual friend of many of ours on the conversation has been leading, which is this idea of the software bill of materials. So it's a more protected version of transparency, whereas I think Alan Friedman, to whom I'm referencing, who was at NTIA and is now at the Department of Homeland Security, has described, we're not talking about the finest elements of details, but a high enough, a detailed enough sense of to enable those who have deployed the software within their environments to make a decision about how big their risk is if there is a vulnerability that's discovered. I failed to mention in my opening remarks another of Alan's comments that is one of my favorite, which is to say that the solution to this is not to nerd harder. We really need to think about really this kind of all hands and all tools approach. So transparency being one of them.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Ari now. Thank you. That was exactly right, and I've got 3 tweets already.
I was going to mention SBOM as well, especially because Megan just talked about transparency. But instead, I'll talk about the other piece that I was going to bring up, which is the secure development lifecycle, right? And so this is an idea that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the U.S., has pushed for a long time, supported for a long time, but has now really grown to be kind of a global idea here, that we need to have a clear path for how software is created, what happens when it's out there, how do we close it off, right? And what do we need to do to make sure that old software doesn't stay around with us forever too. So, and there's all different pieces to this. It's really, so I'm sort of cheating a little bit. Instead of taking one standard, I'm taking the group of standards here, but it's the concept of the security. Trying to get more people on the same page with that idea. We now have ANISA in Europe looking at secure development lifecycle. I think if we can kind of bridge where ANISA is, where NIST is, some of the work that's happening in Japan around secure development lifecycle, we're going to end up in a good place internationally among our allies for being able to come up with solutions. So I think that's really the key structural idea here.
Thanks. And I should mention that Alan Friedman was also part of our virtual workshop and gave us several very good insights about SBOM and other things as well. So Joy, it's over to you. 2 very good ideas have already been put on the table, but I think you have a few more. And I'll add to the question and say, what has Taiwan done that you think they should be most proud of so far in developing safer software?
Okay, definitely concur with what Megan and Ari said. I think that those are very important. Those are the key things. What Taiwan has been done, which I think is very successful, is that there are agencies that's been promoting the standards and also the safe software by doing a lot of the testing. okay, the testing, the validation, the verification of the software that's been developed in-house in Taiwan, that's been required to be done so in order to send it to the government procurement, so that when the government is making a procurement requirements, it has certain aspect as far as for the requirement goes that needs to be passed certain testing. Those testing are currently done in the domestic way, but pretty much follow the best practice and align with the NIST. The NIST is very comprehensive, so it's not everything, but it's the primary things that people think that it's important to make the software safe.
Thank you again, and thanks for short, concise, and very useful suggestions. So now I get to take my last question before turning to the audience. And I would remind people that they can submit their questions by typing in the YouTube chat. We'd also welcome any comments you might have either there in the YouTube chat, or you can engage in a discussion using the hashtag on Twitter, TWSaferSW. So Taiwan Safer Software. So the opposite question is, as you look around the world and as you hear people debating how to make our information infrastructure more secure, what is the stupidest idea that you've heard, either from government or consultants and others who are promoting better cybersecurity? And I'll start. I think the absolute stupidest idea is to have governments require some kind of licensing for software developers. Megan mentioned how we need more people in school to be trained in cybersecurity, and that every software developer needs that training. But a lot of incredible coders didn't even graduate high school. And several famous ones who now run trillion-dollar companies dropped out of college. So they probably never got to the point where they took cybersecurity. So that's my nomination for stupidest idea for developing safer software and better supply chains. Who wants to take on that question?
I already raised this a little bit in my intro, but I'll go again with the idea that we can think that we're only allowing people from our own countries to code for certain areas, right? For critical efforts. I understand where that idea comes from, but I just think if you know that's the way that software supply chain works, you see that is very short-sighted in the long run, and actually ends up hurting the countries that are going to end up taking that kind of approach. So and not really feasible to enforce either. So.
Yeah, well, that's not just a matter of Russia and China, but here in the US in the last administration, we had the Clean Network Initiative and Clean Apps Initiative. It's very hard to justify that if, first off, if you can't really prevent people from using an app and downloading it on their phone, and if there's no real evidence that a particular piece of code is bad. I mean, that's...
If there's evidence that code is bad, I mean, then you could work on the fact that the code is bad. Or you monitor, and if you're concerned about certain code, you can monitor that and look for, how it's used and try and sandbox it, et cetera. But the idea that you're gonna force the creation of code only to be done by certain nationalities, I think is it's going to make this a much more difficult task.
Blanket ban. Well, the people in the government of India, as part of a geopolitical spat and a border skirmish in the Himalaya, decided to ban about 200 Chinese apps. And again, it was justified in terms of cybersecurity and leaking private data, but it was really about punishing the Chinese. So that's another example of where cybersecurity policy merges into protectionism. Joy, do you have an example of something that doesn't work?
Sure. When I look at this, I think that some of the not very smart things to do is now to utilize what's available, that's out there, that's already been proven secure and the quality. One good example is that many of the people are going to cloud. They are good, capable service providers that's already demonstrate the good use of it. I think that but yet that they are stupid things that people may be thinking that I still want to build something on my own and start from scratch. I think it's a waste of time. It's not utilized what's out there that's already available. But I think one of the note on that is that to be able to utilize what's available, such as cloud, it's really that how good you understand the use of it and make the right proper configuration so you can really make the best out of it instead of just saying that I'm using it, but really make a good use of it.
I'm so glad you mentioned another one of my favorite words, which is cloud, which is sort of woven through the entire report. And I think that's one place that Taiwan does have a competitive advantage because, like the US, for more than 10 years, the government has been pushing ministries to move over to the cloud and to take advantage of some of the best tools available, even if they're not made by Taiwan engineers, although some of them are made by Taiwan engineers. They just happen to be working for Amazon or Google or Microsoft or IBM. So Megan, I know there's a lot of other stupid ideas out there. What would be at the top of your list?
Maybe it builds a bit on what others have said a minute ago, which is to say that thinking that a purely regulatory approach is going to solve this. Among other things, sort of over-regulating in this space will, I think, constrain a number of things, but in particular, the ability for us to compete, or Taiwan, others to compete internationally and to leverage the capabilities that partners and allies have had. So thinking that, to take one extreme, Ari's idea that it's kind of a domestic only approach and regulating to that extent, I think is short-sighted, to say the least, and limits the opportunity also for there to be kind of a broader coalition that is taking this approach of a more secure software supply chain.
One of the things that we highlighted in the report is that by moving to the cloud and by partnering with some of the global companies, both the hyperscale cloud companies and also with some of the companies in the hardware business, Taiwan software developers can just plug into a global marketing machine so they can quickly reach customers that they wouldn't be able to reach on their own. And so we haven't seen many questions yet. So let me ask another related question, which is, we just had a big push from the Biden White House, one of the longer executive orders that I've ever read. Ari and I both have worked in the White House in the past, and we know how hard it is to get all these agencies to agree on something, even if it's a page or two. This executive order, it's quite extensive. It has a lot of very good ideas, some of which we've already mentioned. So I guess I'd ask, how do you think the U.S. could help accomplish the goals in the executive order by working internationally, by working with companies in Taiwan, companies in India, companies in Europe? I mean, what is there something that's missing in that executive order, or an approach that might make it easier for U.S. companies and U.S. agencies to work across borders?
Well, as Megan said, I mean, a lot of it's focused on what agencies should do. I think a lot of that is because that's where the president has the power to immediately change things without legislation, right? So it made it so it was a quick area where they could do work immediately and respond to some of the recent attacks that they had seen in the government during the last administration and during the transition. And so they immediately went to use those powers to address these issues. So I think that they're using the power of the purse. I think that means that in the procurement discussions, if you want to make it international, you need to have international. You can work with other countries to have similar rules of their own, right? But that also means allowing American companies and Taiwanese companies to sell to European companies, and European companies to sell to Americans and Taiwanese companies. So agencies, I mean, so there's an opening there that is about how do you go about making these determinations in using procurement as the tool. It's obviously a lot stronger incentive in the U.S. when you have our government's spending so much money to buy software right now. I mean, it's even hard to tally the exact number of cybersecurity, even just cybersecurity software, let alone IT, and cloud services, right, that the U.S. government is purchasing, and what comes out, and I think that moves into some of the new bills that are passing related to in the U.S. the infrastructure package that just went through, which has those pieces as well, and then other ties like that. Where but I do go back to that kind of the procurement as a tool effort that is sort of the fastest moving piece here. Not the only piece, though.
Megan, do you have any thoughts? If you were at the White House trying to coordinate implementation of this executive order, are there one or two things that you would push forward? I know the folks at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, have been working late nights, doing lots of outreach. But I also know that the executive order is very long. It's hard to write one. It's 10 or 20 times harder to implement one. So what's your advice?
Sure. Well, I think, as Ari noted, executive orders are a tool to exercise the government's existing authorities in a kind of in a slightly different or an enhanced way, but they are impact, and one of the reasons they're used is that they're actually not limited to affecting government agencies, right? They can have downstream effects into the marketplace, and that's, I think, the one of the tools that I would be thinking about, or one of the stakeholders that I would be thinking about, is really not limiting ourselves to thinking about what is DHS doing in its international engagements, but how are we partnering with some of the trade associations and the like, both in the United States but elsewhere, to work and bring in the private sector to really kind of expand and accelerate the priorities and the opportunities that can be created through the requirements in the executive order. So rather than feeling like it's a burden to have to comply with potentially the pilot of a trust mark, it's an opportunity to then get in on the ground floor. To highlight the trust mark idea. It's not something that's limited to procurement in the United States. The UK is evolving an approach such as this, as well as Singapore. So again, thinking about how can we bring the private sector, not only in the United States, but particularly in other key economies, to evolve a spirit of innovation and competition around requirements that have been evolved.
Thanks. So, Joy, I don't expect you to be an expert on the Biden executive order on cybersecurity, although if you've seen something there that excites you, please let me know. Both Ari and Megan spend a lot of time with American companies, and so there's a lot of focus here on the executive order. And I would commend Ari and his colleagues at Venable. They just did the Cyber Next conference, which was extraordinary. All the right people addressing a lot of the right questions. So, Joy, I'm going to ask you a harder question, which is, what are the barriers in Taiwan to doing some of the work that needs to be done? In a report, we noticed one big barrier is that a lot of the best and the brightest cybersecurity experts, computer scientists, people who might be the next software entrepreneur, they are lured into the hardware side because that's where the big companies are. That's where a lot of the highest, biggest salaries are. There are great startups happening in the software side, but most of the jobs are still in hardware, and that is one reason I think we're not making as much progress as you might. But what are the other problems, barriers in Taiwan, and are you seeing progress?
Well, Michael, you pretty much said it. I think those are the major barrier. I think the people are looking for something that they are searching as their goals. The big companies in the semiconductors, that they pretty much takes all the talents that there is, and they left the other talents which probably are going to the other field. So I think that it's the policy, it's the incentive, and it's also the culture, because people tend to feel more comfortable to go into an industry that's already been demonstrated their success, such as in the semiconductor, in the science park, that people saying that, well, other than the semiconductor, where else can they go, or where else would they want to go? So the software part, I think it's always interesting, and I'm a firm believer on the going back to the basic, because I think that the school trains many of the talents, whether they go into the semiconductor or other industry, the trainings are pretty much the same. It's that where the incentives are, where they will be. So I think the government is going to be trying very hard to make some policy or strategy to start other industry other than what's already been success in the semiconductor or the hardware. Hardware happened to be success in the last decades, but I think people start seeing that things are changing. And with the digital development ministry that's going to be established very soon in Taiwan, I think they're trying to integrate the hardware, the software, the talents, utilize the different service provider that's being established, their success here or there, abroad or domestic, and trying to bring everything together, because we know that this is not something we can move by ourselves. This is something that we needed to really a combined effort, and really going forward by stepping on other people's, step on other people's shoulder to looking in the greater picture to really bring everything integrated together. So I think the policy needs to be changed, and I think they are doing that. The new ministry, people give a lot of the high hopes, thinking that, other than distribute into the different government agencies, it should be really combined in one, be consistent, be strategy concise. So I think that's what the government and the policies are doing. That's going to be help.
In our report, we mentioned the importance of digital leadership, not just having a ministry that's identified as leading the effort on safer software, but actually having the president or the prime minister of the country stand up and say, this is a national goal. This is a critical function that's needed. And that's what Biden did with the cybersecurity executive order. That's what we did 20 years ago when I was working in the Clinton White House, and Bill Clinton and Al Gore were talking about the need to move beyond coax cable and go to fiber, and they were leading on the whitehouse.gov website. That kind of stamp of approval from the highest level is very important. But I think there's also a lot of need to focus on the lowest level, and that is looking at citizens and the attitudes. And you mentioned it. Culture is so important. When I taught at Georgetown, I was part of the communication, culture, and technology program. Technology is hard, but culture is even harder. And I think Taiwan has an advantage there. You have a lot of people who are willing to take risks. There are countries, particularly in Europe, where there is a sense that you build on what's already there. You don't try to break any models. I wrote a piece on 6 myths of innovation policy, and I noted that in France, they invented the word entrepreneur, but very few families would want their daughter or son to marry one. And so, is the culture changing in Taiwan? I mean, is it exciting and sexy to be a software entrepreneur? 20 years ago, we had a phase where even fashion magazines had covers with the word geek chic. And the people who were building our digital economy were kind of the superstars, right after the basketball players and the football players and the race car drivers. It's a little different now, but there was a period 20 years ago that got a lot of people excited about software, and they became computer scientists, and now they're helping run the companies that are dominating certain sectors of the IT market.
Yes, I think the answer is definitely absolutely yes. The software engineers are looking for more opportunities. I think there are still people who's going to try to go into so-called the comfort zone because they know it's a success industry. But there's definitely more people who's looking for the different innovations that everybody can code pretty much nowadays. It's that how well you code, how safe the code is. And there's so many things can be building on top of it. I think that people are looking for much more entrepreneurial innovation, the different a different journey for their software role. I think that it's happening. We haven't really seen much of so-called unicorn, but it's happening. I'm sure that this is a transition. It's a progress.
Okay, I'm going to finish with the hardest question. And it may be that we can't address this question without being in a super secure, top secret facility. And then I'm going to ask each of you to spend 1 minute to give me your final tweet or your final idea. Tell me whether you're optimistic or pessimistic, whatever you want to talk about in that last minute. So the hardest question is, how do we deal with the fact that within each government, there's often a fight about how secure we really want the software to be? In our country, the FBI and law enforcement have often taken advantages of vulnerabilities in cell phones that allow them to crack the code and decrypt data from criminals. And certainly the national security agencies around the world are often trying to insert vulnerabilities into code that's widely used so that they can listen in. And again, this isn't just China and Russia. So is this something that's going to go away at some point, or are governments always going to have an interest in having some vulnerabilities on the code that companies and their intelligence gathering targets are using? Ari, I'm going to start with you because you were there. You've seen this fight over when do we disclose vulnerabilities? When the spies find a vulnerability, should they call up Microsoft and say, "Hey, why don't you fix it?"
Well, I've written papers on this, so I point people to the vulnerabilities equities process that's been built, and that now we've had 3 administrations that have been, or actually 4, because it was really the Bush administration that put it forward first, although it wasn't really totally working. But when they left, they were the ones who put the idea forward, so they do deserve that credit. So it's really been 4 administrations in the U.S. that have continually run this vulnerabilities equities process. I do think it has improved over time, and I think other countries are starting to look at it and come up with similar ideas, even if it's not exactly the same. Where, yes, when we find something, we have a determination inside the U.S. government whether it's something that we can use right then or it's something that should be disclosed.
Okay.
And we don't go around storing things, right? Storing vulnerabilities to use maybe in the future, because we know that they get leaked, right?
Okay.
That's the problem, right? If you find a vulnerability and you try and store it, it's shown. We've seen it in the U.S. being the number 1 target here. It's come out, and I will give Taiwan some credit here too. The Taiwan CERT 3 years ago moved to publishing the vulnerabilities that they get reported to them, and doing it very publicly and building transparency in there as well, which is the global norm at this point. Not every country is doing that. And when you have I've had some discussions with some countries that I would think would take the attitude that, being proactively and telling companies about vulnerabilities is the right thing to do, even if it's difficult. And there's still some allied countries out there that still take the position, oh no, we need to hold on to those and use those for our purposes, and we can't tell anybody about that. That's just the wrong attitude today.
Okay, so we have just 30 seconds for each of you for a closing tweet. So Joy, what would you tweet out of this conference? I'm
going to say the keyword is going to be human right. Vulnerability, governments, internet governance. I think at the bottom of the day, it's really that how much do we care about the human right and the privacy. Well, my friends in the Carnegie Democracy Program, particularly Steve Feldstein, will be happy to hear that. Megan, your tweet.
I would agree with Joy. I think we really need to think about what's the end game here, and the end game is to enhance social and economic growth for everyone, and so we need secure and stable code to do so. So let's think about how we can leverage all the tools that we have, whether it be in the private sector or by the government, to do so.
And Ari?
I would say building trust among allies through standards is really the key area that I would focus on.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for being available for this discussion, particularly you, Joy, because I know it's getting late. The Twitter sphere was right. This was an all-star panel, and I think we covered some new ground in some new ways. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Michael. And